In the autumn of 1941, as German forces stood at the gates of Moscow and the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of total collapse, Joseph Stalin faced an impossible decision. His armies were stretched across two fronts, fighting for survival in the west, while maintaining a massive defensive force in the east against a potential Japanese invasion. Intelligence reports flooding into the Kremlin painted contradictory pictures of Japanese intentions, and one wrong move could mean the end of the Soviet state. At this critical juncture, a single message from Tokyo would change everything. The man who sent it was Richard Sorge, a German journalist who had spent years building what would become the most successful espionage network of World War II. His story is not just one of individual courage or cunning, but a demonstration of how information, delivered at the right moment, can alter the trajectory of human history. Richard Sorge was born on October 4, 1895, in Baku, then part of the Russian Empire, to a German father and a Russian mother. This dual heritage would define his life and his work, giving him the linguistic skills and cultural fluency to move between worlds that most people could never access. His father, Wilhelm Sorge, worked as an engineer in the Caucasian oil fields, and the family eventually moved to Berlin when Richard was still a child. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Sorge enlisted in the German army with the patriotic fervor typical of his generation. He served on the Western Front, was wounded 3 times, and received the Iron Cross for his bravery. But the war that was supposed to forge his German nationalism instead shattered it completely. The senseless slaughter in the trenches, the collapse of old certainties, and the revolutionary ferment that swept through Europe after 1917 pushed Sorge toward radical politics. By 1919, he had joined the German Communist Party, beginning a transformation from wounded soldier to committed revolutionary. Sorge's intellectual abilities were formidable. After the war, he completed a doctorate in political science at the University of Hamburg in 1920, writing his dissertation on Marxist theory. He worked briefly as a teacher and journalist, but his real calling emerged when he was recruited by Soviet military intelligence, the 4th Department of the Red Army General Staff, later known as the GRU. By 1924, Sorge had moved to Moscow for training, and over the next few years he operated in Scandinavia and Britain, honing his craft. The Soviets recognized in him something rare, a man who could think strategically, who understood both European politics and Marxist ideology, and who possessed the discipline and nerve required for deep cover operations. In 1929, he was sent to China, where he would begin building the networks and methods that would later prove decisive. Sorge's years in Shanghai and later in Tokyo were not simply about gathering secrets. They were about constructing an entirely new identity so convincing that it could withstand the scrutiny of intelligence professionals. He presented himself as a committed Nazi sympathizer and a respected journalist, writing for the Frankfurter Zeitung and other German publications. His articles were well-researched and politically astute, earning him genuine credibility in German circles. This was not a simple disguise that could be put on and taken off. Sorge lived his cover identity completely, drinking heavily, socializing aggressively, and cultivating relationships with the very people he was spying on. The psychological toll of this double life was immense, but it was also what made him so effective. He was not pretending to be a German journalist who sympathized with the Nazis. For all practical purposes, he was that person, except for the secret core of his being that remained loyal to Moscow. In September 1933, Sorge arrived in Japan with a mission of extraordinary scope. He was to assess Japanese military capabilities, determine their strategic intentions, and provide the Soviet Union with advance warning of any potential attack. Japan in the 1930s was a rising military power with expansionist ambitions, and its relationship with the Soviet Union was tense and unpredictable. The two nations had clashed in border conflicts, and the question of whether Japan would strike north into Siberia or south into Southeast Asia and the Pacific was one of the most important strategic uncertainties facing Soviet planners. Sorge's task was to answer that question, and to do so, he would need to penetrate the highest levels of German and Japanese society in Tokyo. The network Sorge built in Japan was a masterpiece of espionage tradecraft. His key recruit was Hatsumi Ozaki, a respected Japanese journalist and China expert, who had access to the inner circles of the Japanese government through his membership in various policy advisory groups. Ozaki was a committed communist who believed he was serving the cause of peace by providing information to the Soviet Union. Through Ozaki, Sorge gained insight into the deliberations of the Japanese cabinet and military leadership. He also recruited Max Clausen, a German radio operator who had worked in Shanghai, to handle communications with Moscow. Branko de Vukalic, a Yugoslav journalist, and Miyagi Yotoku, a Japanese artist who had lived in the United States, rounded out the core of the ring. Each member brought different skills and access, and Sorge orchestrated them with remarkable precision, keeping operational security tight while maximizing the flow of intelligence. What made Sorge's operation particularly effective was his access to the German embassy in Tokyo. As a respected journalist and a German national, he cultivated close friendships with embassy staff, including the ambassador himself, Eugen Ott. Sorge had known Ott from their time together in China, and their relationship was built on genuine personal affection as well as shared professional interests. Ott trusted Sorge completely, often discussing classified information with him and even using him as an unofficial advisor on Japanese affairs. This gave Sorge access to German intelligence assessments, diplomatic cables, and strategic planning documents. He was, in effect, reading both Japanese and German mail simultaneously, providing Moscow with a stereoscopic view of Axis planning in the Far East. The intelligence Sorge provided in the years leading up to World War II was consistently valuable, but it was not always believed. In 1939, he warned Moscow about the German-Japanese anti-Comintern Pact negotiations and provided details about Japanese military planning. He reported on the Nomonhan incident, the border clash between Soviet and Japanese forces in Mongolia that summer, giving Soviet commanders insight into Japanese tactics and intentions. But Sorge's warnings about the impending German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 were among the most tragic examples of intelligence failure in history. Beginning in late 1940 and continuing through the spring of 1941, Sorge sent increasingly urgent messages to Moscow, warning that Germany was preparing to attack. He provided details about troop movements, operational plans, and even specific dates. On May 15, 1941, he transmitted a message stating that the invasion would begin in late June with a force of between 150 and 190 divisions. He was off by only a few days. Operation Barbarossa began on June the 22nd, 1941. Stalin's refusal to heed these warnings has been the subject of endless historical debate. Part of the explanation lies in the Soviet dictator's fundamental distrust of intelligence, especially when it contradicted his own strategic assumptions. Stalin believed that Hitler would not attack until Britain was defeated, and he interpreted the warnings as British disinformation designed to provoke a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. He had also been the victim of deliberate German deception operations that fed false information through multiple channels, making it difficult to distinguish genuine intelligence from planted material. But there was also a deeper psychological factor at work. Stalin had staked enormous political capital on the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, and admitting that Hitler was about to betray that agreement would have been tantamount to admitting a catastrophic error in judgment. So the warnings were ignored, and when the German invasion came, it achieved almost complete tactical surprise, leading to devastating losses for the Red Army in the opening weeks of the campaign. By the autumn of 1941, the situation on the Eastern Front was desperate. German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. Leningrad was under siege, Kiev had fallen, and German spearheads were approaching Moscow. The Soviet Union had lost millions of soldiers, either killed, wounded, or captured. And industrial production had collapsed as factories were hastily evacuated to the east. But even as the Germans closed in on the capital, Stalin faced another strategic dilemma. In the Soviet Far East, he maintained approximately 40 divisions, roughly 700,000 men, along with thousands of tanks and aircraft, to guard against a potential Japanese attack. These were some of the best-equipped and best-trained units in the Red Army, including troops who had fought successfully against the Japanese at Nomonhan in 1939. If Stalin could be certain that Japan would not attack, he could transfer these forces to the west, where they might make the difference between survival and annihilation. But if he moved them and Japan then invaded, the Soviet Union would face a true two-front war that it could not possibly win. This was the moment when Richard Sorge's intelligence became not just valuable, but decisive. Throughout the summer and early autumn of 1941, Sorge worked frantically to determine Japanese intentions. Through Ozaki's access to government circles, he learned that the Japanese leadership was engaged in intense debates about strategy. The Japanese army favored a northern strategy, attacking the Soviet Union to secure resource-rich territories in Siberia. The Navy preferred a southern strategy, striking at British and American possessions in Southeast Asia and the Pacific to secure oil, rubber, and other resources that Japan desperately needed. The question was settled at a series of high-level conferences in July and September 1941. On September 6th, at an Imperial conference in the presence of Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese government made its decision. They would pursue the southern strategy, preparing for war with the United States and Britain while maintaining neutrality with the Soviet Union. Ozaki learned of this decision through his contacts and passed the information to Sorge. On September 14, 1941, Sorge transmitted a message to Moscow that would change the course of the war. He reported that Japan had decided not to attack the Soviet Union in 1941 and that Japanese forces were being redeployed for operations in the South. He followed up with additional messages in October, providing more detail and confirming that the decision was final. This was the intelligence Stalin had been waiting for. For the first time since the German invasion began, he had reliable information that allowed him to make a strategic decision with confidence. He ordered the transfer of divisions from the Far East to the Moscow front. These were not raw recruits or hastily assembled militia units, but veteran formations with full equipment and experienced commanders. The impact of these reinforcements on the Battle of Moscow cannot be overstated. In late November and early December 1941, as German forces made their final push toward the Soviet capital, fresh Siberian divisions began arriving on the front lines. They were equipped with winter clothing and trained for cold weather operations, unlike the German troops who were still in summer uniforms and suffering from the brutal Russian winter. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive along the entire Moscow front. The German advance was stopped, then pushed back. For the first time since the invasion began, the Wehrmacht was forced into a major retreat. The psychological impact was enormous. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the Soviet Union demonstrated that it could not only survive, but fight back. The war was far from over. but the Germans had lost their chance to win it in a single campaign. Historians have debated the precise contribution of Sorge's intelligence to this outcome. Some argue that Stalin would have transferred the Siberian divisions anyway, gambling that Japan would not attack while already engaged in China. Others point out that Soviet intelligence had multiple sources indicating Japanese intentions, and Sorge's reports, while important, were not the only factor in Stalin's decision. But the documentary record shows that Sorge's intelligence was given serious weight in Moscow precisely because of his track record and the quality of his reporting. Unlike many intelligence sources, Sorge provided not just rumors or second-hand information, but detailed assessments based on access to decision-makers. His reports had a specificity and confidence that made them credible, and in the context of autumn 1941, when the Soviet Union was fighting for its very existence, that credibility was worth more than gold. Sorge would not live to see the ultimate victory his intelligence helped make possible. By October 1941, Japanese counterintelligence had begun closing in on his network. The Japanese Special Higher Police, known as the Toko, had been investigating communist activities in Japan for years, and they had gradually accumulated evidence pointing toward a sophisticated espionage ring. Careless tradecraft by some members of Sorge's network, including radio transmissions that were detected and direction-finding operations that narrowed down the location of the transmitter, gave the Japanese the leads they needed. On October 18, 1941, just weeks after sending his crucial message about Japanese intentions, Sorge was arrested at his home in Tokyo. Over the following days, the rest of the network was rounded up. Ozaki was arrested on October 15th, and the others followed soon after. The interrogations that followed revealed the full scope of what Sorge had accomplished. The Japanese were stunned to discover that a German journalist, someone who had been accepted in the highest circles of German society in Tokyo and who had the complete trust of the German ambassador, was actually a Soviet spy. The case became a massive embarrassment for both the Japanese and German governments. For the Japanese, it exposed serious failures in counterintelligence and raised uncomfortable questions about the loyalty of Japanese intellectuals like Ozaki. For the Germans, it was a humiliating reminder that the Nazis' vaunted security apparatus had been completely fooled. Ambassador Ott was recalled to Berlin in disgrace, his career effectively over. Sorge and his co-conspirators were held in Japanese prisons for 3 years, while their case slowly moved through the judicial system. The Japanese government kept the case secret, not wanting to publicize the extent of the intelligence breach. Sorge was interrogated extensively, and he eventually provided detailed confessions, though he tried to protect some of his sources and methods. He maintained his composure throughout, displaying the same calm professionalism that had characterized his espionage work. On September 29, 1943, Sorge and Ozaki were convicted of espionage and sentenced to death. Appeals and legal procedures delayed the execution for another year. On November 7, 1944, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Richard Sorge was hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. He was 49 years old. Ozaki was executed the same day. The Soviet Union did not publicly acknowledge Sorge's work for more than 20 years after his death. During the war, Stalin made no effort to negotiate for his release or even to acknowledge his existence, despite German offers to exchange him for captured German agents. This was partly due to Stalin's general policy of denying any connection with captured spies, but it may also have reflected lingering resentment over Sorge's accurate warnings about the German invasion, which Stalin had ignored. It was only in 1964, more than a decade after Stalin's death, that the Soviet government officially recognized Sorge's contributions. He was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the state could bestow, and his face appeared on Soviet postage stamps. Streets, schools, and even a ship were named after him. He became a symbol of Soviet intelligence success and personal sacrifice for the motherland. The question of how much one man's intelligence work truly changed the course of World War II remains a subject of historical analysis. Wars are decided by countless factors: industrial production, military leadership, the courage of ordinary soldiers, economic resources, and strategic decisions at the highest levels. No single intelligence report, no matter how accurate or timely, can determine the outcome of a conflict on the scale of World War II. But intelligence can affect the margins, and in warfare, margins matter enormously. The transfer of even a few divisions at a critical moment can mean the difference between holding a position and losing it, between launching a successful counteroffensive and watching an opportunity slip away. Sorge's intelligence gave Stalin the confidence to make a decision that carried enormous risk. So, if Sorge had been wrong, if Japan had attacked after the Siberian divisions were transferred west, the consequences would have been catastrophic. But he was right, and those divisions helped stop the German advance on Moscow. The broader significance of Sorge's story extends beyond the specific intelligence he provided. His operation demonstrated the potential value of human intelligence, of agents who could penetrate the inner circles of enemy governments and provide insight into decision-making processes. In an era increasingly dominated by signals intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, and cyber espionage, the Sorge case remains a reminder that understanding what leaders are thinking and planning requires human sources who can observe and report on the nuances of policy debates. Sorge's success also highlighted the importance of long-term intelligence operations. He spent 8 years in Japan building his network and establishing his cover before the critical intelligence emerged. Modern intelligence services, often under pressure to produce immediate results, can learn from the patience and long-term planning that characterized Soviet intelligence operations during this period. The story also raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between intelligence and decision-making. Sorge provided accurate, timely intelligence about the German invasion plans, and it was ignored. This was not because the intelligence was poorly presented or because it failed to reach the right people. Stalin himself saw the reports. The failure was one of belief and interpretation. Stalin's preconceptions about Hitler's intentions were so strong that they overrode the evidence. This phenomenon, known to intelligence analysts as confirmation bias, remains a persistent challenge. Leaders tend to accept intelligence that confirms what they already believe and to discount or rationalize away intelligence that contradicts their assumptions. The most accurate intelligence in the world is useless if decision-makers refuse to act on it. Sorge's personal story is also a study in the psychological costs of espionage. Living a double life for years, maintaining cover identities, building relationships based on deception, and constantly managing the risk of exposure takes an enormous toll. Sorge drank heavily, partly as cover for his activities, and partly, one suspects, as a way of managing the stress. He had relationships with multiple women, including the wife of a German embassy official, and these relationships were both genuine emotional connections and operational necessities. The line between his real self and his cover identity became increasingly blurred. In his prison writings, Sorge reflected on his life and his choices, and while he remained committed to the communist cause, there is also a sense of weariness, of a man who had spent too long living in the shadows. The legacy of Richard Sorge extends into the Cold War and beyond. Soviet intelligence services held him up as a model of the ideal intelligence officer: committed, professional, patient, and willing to sacrifice everything for the mission. His story was used in training programs and as inspiration for new generations of intelligence officers. In the West, particularly in the United States and Britain. Intelligence professionals studied his methods and tried to understand how he had been so successful. The Sorge case influenced thinking about counterintelligence and the vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. It also contributed to the paranoia about communist infiltration that characterized the early Cold War period, feeding fears that Soviet agents might be operating at the highest levels of Western governments. In Japan, the Sorge case remained a source of controversy and fascination. Ozaki Hotsumi, in particular, became a complex figure in post-war Japanese historical memory. Some saw him as a traitor who had betrayed his country. Others viewed him as a man of conscience who had opposed Japanese militarism and tried to prevent a catastrophic war. Books, films, and television dramas have explored the Sorge ring, each generation finding new meanings in the story. The house where Sorge lived in Tokyo has been preserved, and there is a small museum dedicated to his memory, reflecting the ambivalent Japanese attitude toward a man who spied against Japan but whose intelligence may have helped end the war sooner by contributing to Germany's defeat. The strategic intelligence that Sorge provided about Japanese intentions in 1941 was part of a larger pattern of Soviet intelligence success during World War II. The Soviet Union ran extensive espionage networks in Germany, Britain, the United States, and other countries, providing information about military plans, technological developments, and political decisions. Some of this intelligence, like the information about the atomic bomb project obtained through the Cambridge Five and other sources, would have profound implications for the post-war world. Soviet intelligence was not infallible, and there were significant failures, but the overall record was impressive. This success was built on a combination of ideological commitment, professional tradecraft, and the willingness to invest resources in long-term operations. Sorge embodied all of these qualities. As we look back on Richard Sorge's life and work from the perspective of the 21st century, several lessons emerge. First, information has strategic value, but only if it reaches decision-makers who are willing to act on it. The most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world cannot prevent disasters if political leaders refuse to listen. Second, successful intelligence operations require patience, planning, and a willingness to invest in long-term penetration of target organizations. There are no shortcuts to building the kind of access that Sorge achieved. Third, the human cost of espionage is real and substantial. Sorge paid with his life, as did many of his collaborators. Even those who survive carry psychological scars from years of deception and fear. Finally, the impact of intelligence work is often impossible to measure precisely. We can never know with absolute certainty how history would have unfolded if Sorge had not sent his message about Japanese intentions in September 1941. But we can say with confidence that his intelligence contributed to one of the most important Soviet victories of World War II and helped ensure that the Red Army survived to fight another day. The Battle of Moscow in December 1941 was a turning point in World War II, demonstrating that Nazi Germany could be defeated and setting the stage for the long, grinding campaigns that would eventually lead to Berlin. The Siberian divisions that helped stop the German advance were there because Stalin knew, with a certainty he had lacked before, that Japan would not attack. He knew this because Richard Sorge, a German communist who had spent 8 years building a cover identity and an intelligence network in Tokyo, had told him so. In the vast machinery of World War II, with its millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks and aircraft, one man's intelligence work mattered. It did not win the war by itself, but it helped create the conditions for victory. That is Richard Sorge's legacy, and it remains relevant today in a world where information, more than ever, shapes the decisions that determine the fate of nations.